I lived alone for the first time at 30, and after 6 months of complete silence, I began to understand things about myself that 10 years of living with other people had successfully hidden from me. I want to start with the noise, because the noise is where everything begins. Not the noise of living alone, which is what most people assume is the difficult part, the absence of sound, the quiet that sits in the corners of a new apartment and takes some getting used to. I want to start with the noise of the decade before that, the 10 years of shared kitchens and shared living rooms and shared walls, the continuous ambient presence of other people that I had been submerged in since I was 19 years old, and that I had, without knowing I was doing it, been using as a kind of insulation. Against what, exactly, I did not know until the insulation was gone. That is the thing about insulation. You only understand what it was protecting you from once you are no longer protected. My name is Jonas. I am 32 now and I live in a one-bedroom apartment in a city I have been in for 4 years, and I have lived alone in that apartment for 2 of those 4 years, and those 2 years have been the most genuinely instructive of my adult life in ways I did not anticipate and would not have chosen if someone had described them to me in advance. I am writing about it because I think the particular education of living alone for the first time as a real adult, not a student, not someone between situations, but a person making a deliberate choice to inhabit a space entirely alone, is something that does not get talked about honestly very often. What gets talked about is the loneliness, which is real and which I will get to, and the freedom, which is also real and which is not as straightforwardly good as it sounds. What does not get talked about as much is the confrontation. The specific, ongoing, impossible to avoid confrontation with yourself that happens when there is nobody else in the apartment to look at instead. I will give you the background quickly, because it is not the most interesting part. I went to university at 19 and lived in shared housing for 2 years, and then moved in with my first serious girlfriend for 3 years, and then moved in with 2 friends after that ended for 2 years, and then lived with a different partner for 3 years before that also ended. And at the end of all of that I was 30 years old, and for the first time since I had left my parents' house at 19, I was looking at the prospect of living alone. I had never done it. Not for a single month. My adult life had been a continuous sequence of other people's presences, other people's rhythms, other people's sounds and habits and schedules, and I had organized myself around all of it so completely that I was not entirely sure, standing in an empty apartment for the first time, what I looked like when there was no one else's shape to organize around. I took the apartment because the timing was practical. The relationship had ended, the shared living situation had ended with it. I needed somewhere to go and the apartment was available and affordable and in a neighborhood I liked. I did not take it as an experiment or an exercise in self-discovery. I took it because I needed somewhere to live. The experiment arrived uninvited and made itself at home without asking. The first month was fine. I want to be honest about this because the narrative of someone discovering themselves through solitude tends to skip the part where the first month is just logistically uncomfortable in ordinary ways. I did not know where I had put things. I ate at the wrong times because there was no shared meal rhythm to organize around. I went to bed later than was good for me because there was nobody else's bedtime to influence mine. I watched more television than I had in years, not because I particularly wanted to, but because the television filled the apartment with voices, and the apartment without voices felt, in those first weeks, like a question I was not yet ready to answer. The question announced itself around week 5 or 6. I cannot give you a precise date, but I can give you a precise moment, which was a Sunday afternoon when I had nothing scheduled, and no one coming over and no particular reason to leave, and I sat down on my couch, and the television was off and the apartment was quiet, and I became aware, with a clarity that was slightly startling, that I did not know what I wanted to do. Not in the ordinary way of having too many options and not being able to choose. In a more specific way, I did not know, absent the structure of other people's wants and needs and preferences, what my own default mode was, what I did when I was purely left to myself, what I wanted from an afternoon that belonged entirely to me. I sat with that for a while, then I turned the television on because the question was uncomfortable and I was not ready for it yet. But the question did not go away, it just waited. It had patience that I did not have, and over the weeks that followed it kept presenting itself in small specific ways that I could not indefinitely avoid. The Sunday afternoon became a recurring event. The silence became more familiar and less alarming, and as it became more familiar it became more informative, because silence has a way of amplifying things you have been too busy or too surrounded to hear. The first thing I heard, sitting in the silence with more regularity, was how much of my sense of myself had been constructed in relation to other people, rather than in relation to anything internal. What I mean by this is that for 10 years my understanding of who I was had been assembled almost entirely from feedback, from how people responded to me, from the roles I played in shared spaces, from the identity that formed in the friction and warmth of constant proximity to others. I was the person who cooked in the shared house. I was the organized one in the relationship, the one who kept track of things. I was the one who stayed up late and talked. These were real parts of me, but they were also parts that only existed in the presence of other people to define them against, and without other people to define myself against I was finding that the internal version of me, the version that did not require anyone else for its coordinates, was less legible than I had assumed. This was not a crisis. I want to be clear about that because I know it sounds like one. It was more like discovering that a room you thought you knew well had, when examined in better light, a different layout than you had assumed. Disorienting, interesting, not cause for alarm but cause for attention. I started paying attention differently around the third month. Not deliberately, not as a project, but because the silence had become familiar enough that I could hear things in it that the noise of the previous decade had covered. And what I began to hear, slowly and in pieces, was an account of myself that was somewhat different from the one I had been giving. The first thing I noticed, with the particular clarity that comes from having nobody else to look at, was my relationship with mornings. For 10 years I had understood myself as someone who was not a morning person. This had been a settled fact about me, confirmed repeatedly in shared living situations where I was reliably the last one up, the one who needed time and coffee and silence before being functional, the one who communicated in grunts before 10 o'clock. My partners and housemates had understood this about me. I had understood this about myself. It was in the basic inventory of who Jonas was. Living alone, with nobody else's morning to compare mine to and nobody else's schedule to accommodate or resist, I discovered that I woke up naturally at around 6:30, without an alarm, without resentment. I lay in the quiet apartment in the early morning light and felt, not the reluctant surfacing of someone dragged from sleep, but the clean alertness of someone whose body had arrived at the time it actually wanted to be awake. I got up and made coffee, and the morning was mine in a way it had never been in a shared space, and it turned out that what I had believed for a decade was my natural morning state had actually been my response to other people's morning states. The grumpiness had been social, the slowness had been relational. Alone, I was someone who liked mornings. This was a small discovery in practical terms. In terms of what it suggested about the reliability of my self-knowledge, it was not small at all. I started paying attention to other things I had assumed about myself and examining whether they held up in the absence of the social contexts that had produced them. Some did. I genuinely preferred reading to most other leisure activities, and this remained true alone in a way that felt internal rather than performed. I genuinely found cooking satisfying, and I cooked for myself with the same care I had always cooked for other people, which told me the satisfaction was in the making rather than in the audience. These things were real, but others did not survive the examination. I had always considered myself someone who needed a lot of social contact. This had been another settled fact, confirmed by a decade of living with people and a fairly active social life, and a general discomfort with the idea of too much alone time. Living alone, I discovered that what I had actually needed was not social contact specifically, but the option of social contact. The knowledge that someone was in the next room, that interaction was available without effort, that I was not alone by default. What I had experienced as a need for social contact had been, at least in part, a need for the feeling of availability, the potential of company rather than company itself. Alone in my apartment, knowing that if I wanted to see someone I could make a plan and see someone, I was much more content with solitude than I had ever believed I could be. These discoveries accumulated over the third and fourth months in a way that was both interesting and faintly destabilizing. Interesting because learning true things about yourself is interesting even when they are unexpected. Destabilizing because each discovery was implicitly also a re-examination of the decade before it, a question mark placed next to decisions and relationships and self-descriptions that I had treated as settled, and was now finding to be somewhat more provisional than I had assumed. The fourth month was when the less comfortable discoveries began. I had been in all the shared living situations of the previous decade, someone who was described by others as easygoing, low maintenance, adaptable, good to live with. I had taken this as accurate and had taken some quiet pride in it, the pride of someone who believed they moved through shared spaces without friction, who was considerate and flexible and did not make things difficult. Living alone, in the absence of any shared space to navigate, I began to notice the internal experience that had been producing that easygoing exterior, and it was not entirely what the exterior had suggested. What I found was that a significant portion of what had registered to others as easygoing had been, from the inside, accommodation. The two are different things, and the difference matters. Accommodation is the adjustment of your own preferences and needs to fit the available space, which is a necessary and reasonable thing that all people who live with other people do to some extent. The issue is when the accommodation becomes so habitual and so complete that you stop being aware that you are doing it, stop noticing the gap between what you actually want and what you are settling for, because the gap has been present long enough that it has started to feel like the natural state of things. I noticed the gap in small ways at first. I noticed that I ate what I actually wanted to eat, which was not always what I had eaten in shared kitchens, where the path of least resistance had been to align with whoever had stronger food preferences. I noticed that I kept the apartment at a temperature that was comfortable for me, which was slightly warmer than the compromised temperature of every shared space I had lived in. I noticed that I went to bed when I was tired, not when the social rhythm of the evening suggested it was an appropriate time to disengage from it. These were trivial adjustments, but they were also a continuous revelation of the accumulation of small preferences that I had been quietly overriding for 10 years in the name of being good to live with. The less trivial version of this showed up in my thinking about the relationships that had ended. Both of them had been good relationships with genuinely good people, and both of them had ended for reasons that I had understood at the time as mutual and organic, the natural completion of something that had run its course. Living alone and thinking about them with the particular clear-eyed attention that solitude produced, I began to see both of them differently. Not to revise my verdict that they were good relationships or that ending them had been right, but to notice, in both of them, a pattern of accommodation that had been so thoroughgoing that I was not sure either of my former partners had ever encountered anything resembling my actual preferences in any domain where our preferences diverged. I had been in those relationships, so reliably accommodating that I had effectively made myself illegible. There was no version of me in either relationship that said clearly what I wanted and held that position in the face of mild resistance. There was a version that had preferences, and then had different preferences when the first one seemed inconvenient or unpopular. That version had been very easy to live with. It had also been, I was now understanding, somewhat dishonest without intending to be, because it had presented easygoingness as a personality trait when it was actually a strategy, and strategies and personality traits are different things, even when they produce identical behavior. This realization did not arrive all at once. It arrived in pieces across the 4th and 5th months, each piece adding to a picture that I was assembling slowly and without particular enthusiasm, because the picture was not entirely flattering. I am a person who prefers flattering pictures of himself, which is probably true of most people, and I had to work against that preference to look at this one honestly. The 5th month was when the loneliness arrived in earnest. I want to talk about this directly, because I have been mostly describing the intellectual and reflective dimension of living alone, and that is only part of the truth. The other part is that there were weeks in the 5th month where the apartment felt genuinely too quiet, where the solitude that had been informative and interesting tipped over into something heavier and less comfortable, where I would have given a significant amount to have another person in the kitchen, doing nothing in particular, simply for the fact of their presence in the space. The loneliness was specific rather than general. It was not loneliness for people in the abstract, because I was seeing friends and had a functional social life and was not isolated. It was loneliness for the ordinary daily intimacy of shared living, the small unremarkable textures of cohabitation, the sound of someone else moving through the apartment, the natural rhythm of two people's days intersecting in the kitchen at the end of them. That kind of intimacy is so ordinary when you have it that you barely register it as a thing of value. When it is gone, it turns out to have been a significant source of something that does not have a precise name, but that is closer to comfort than to anything else. I sat with the loneliness rather than immediately trying to solve it, which was a new thing for me. The previous decade had produced in me a strong habit of solving discomfort by adjusting the social environment, by being around people more, by filling the silence with noise. Living alone and committed, at least experimentally, to staying with the silence and seeing what it contained, I tried to let the loneliness be present without immediately acting on it. What I found, sitting with it, was that it had two distinct components that I had been treating as one. There was the genuine need for connection, the human requirement for intimacy and warmth that is not negotiable and should not be negotiated with. And there was something else underneath it, something that was not really loneliness at all, but more like unfamiliarity, the strangeness of being with myself without the buffer of other people, the discomfort of a self-encounter that I had been successfully avoiding for a decade. The second component was the more interesting one, and it was the one the previous decade had been most effectively protecting me from. The self-encounter that the decade of cohabitation had been protecting me from was not dramatic. I want to establish that clearly because the phrase self-encounter carries connotations of crisis or revelation that overstate what I am describing. It was not a dark night of the soul. It was not a breakdown or a confrontation with some buried trauma or anything that would make a compelling scene in a film about personal transformation. It was something quieter and in some ways more unsettling precisely because of its quietness, which was the gradual discovery that I did not particularly like being alone with my own thoughts, and that this dislike was not incidental to who I was, but was in fact one of the more organizing facts about me, a fact I had spent 10 years successfully not examining. I discovered this through reading, of all things. Reading had always been one of the genuine pleasures I had identified as internal rather than social, one of the things that survived the examination I had been doing of my habits and preferences. And it was genuine. I did love reading, and I read more living alone than I had in years. But I noticed, paying attention the way I had been paying attention, that I had a strong tendency to reach for a book specifically at the moments when my thoughts were becoming uncomfortable. Not when I wanted to read, but when I wanted to not think. The book was not always an expression of enjoyment. Sometimes it was an escape route. This is not a pathology. Everyone uses books and films and music and conversation, and 100 other things to manage the experience of their own mind, and there is nothing wrong with that. The issue for me was that I had been doing it so automatically and so thoroughly that I had never actually sat with the uncomfortable thoughts long enough to find out what they were. I had been using the continuous presence of other people, and in their absence a continuous stream of consuming activities, as a mechanism for not having to be in my own head for extended periods. The mechanism had worked very well. It had worked so well that at 30 years old, I was only now discovering it existed. What was in the uncomfortable thoughts, when I finally let them be present without immediately reaching for an exit, was not revelatory in its content. It was ordinary anxiety, the kind that most people have, about whether I was doing the right things with my life, and whether the choices I had made were good ones, and whether the person I was becoming was a person I would want to be. Standard issue human uncertainty. The kind of thing that most people have a working relationship with, because they have encountered it enough times to know that it passes and is manageable and does not require immediate action. I did not have a working relationship with it, because I had never spent enough time with it to develop one. Every time it had surfaced in the previous decade, there had been someone nearby to talk to or something to watch, or the natural social rhythm of a shared living situation to resubmerge into, and I had resubmerged gratefully and automatically, and the anxiety had gone back under, and I had continued. Living alone, it could not go back under. There was nowhere for it to go, and staying with it, learning to let it be present without treating it as an emergency, was the most practically useful thing the first 6 months of solitude produced. Not because the anxiety went away, because it did not entirely go away and I do not think it will, but because I developed, slowly and through repetition, the ability to sit in the same room with it without being controlled by it. To notice it and acknowledge it, and let it exist alongside me, while I did the other things I was doing, rather than treating its presence as something that required immediate escape. This sounds abstract, so let me make it concrete. By the end of the 6th month, I was capable of sitting on my couch on a Sunday afternoon with nothing on and nowhere to be and no particular plan, and the familiar low-grade anxiety present in the background, and simply being in the apartment without doing anything about it. Just sitting, just being in the quiet. Just letting the afternoon be an afternoon without needing to fill it, or escape it, or turn it into something more productive or more social, or more anything than it was. This is, I understand, a description of a skill that many people develop naturally and early and would not think to describe as an achievement. For me, it was an achievement, a genuine one. It had taken 6 months of sustained and frequently uncomfortable practice, and I was not embarrassed to recognize it as something I had earned. The 6th month also brought a different kind of discovery, one that was less about internal mechanics and more about the shape of the life I actually wanted to be living. I had been in the first months of solitude, primarily focused on the experience of being alone, on understanding what it was and what it required, and what it was teaching me. By the 6th month, I had developed enough familiarity with that experience that I could look past it towards something further, which was the question of what I actually wanted the next chapter of my life to look like. This was a question I had technically been asking myself for years, in the ordinary way that adults periodically ask themselves what they want and then get absorbed back into the structure of their existing lives before they arrive at a real answer. Living alone, the structure was thinner. There were fewer given things, fewer defaults, fewer other people's structures to live inside of. And in that thinner structure, the question had more room, and in having more room, it became more specific. What I found, examining it specifically, was that the life I had been living for the previous several years had been organized much more around availability and momentum than around actual choice. I had been in the city I was in because the second relationship had been in that city. I had been in the job I was in because it was a reasonable continuation of what I had been doing. I had been in the social world I was in because it had accumulated organically around the relationships and the job. None of these things were bad, they were fine, but they were fine in the way that things are fine when you have not examined them, and examined, some of them were less fine than others. The job was the clearest example. I was a project manager at a company that made software for industries I had no particular interest in, doing work that I was competent at and that paid well, and that did not require very much of me in the ways I actually wanted to be required. I had known this for a while in a vague background way, and had never done anything about it because the job was fine, and the life it funded was fine, and changing it would have required an amount of energy and uncertainty that I had never quite mustered. Living alone in the silence, the background knowledge that the job was fine, but not right, moved from background to foreground in a way I could no longer comfortably push back down. I did not immediately quit the job. I want to be clear about that because the version of this story where self-discovery produces immediate dramatic action is a satisfying version, but not an honest one. What I did was start paying attention to what the job actually felt like from the inside, which I had not been doing carefully before, and what I found was that it felt like a significant portion of my available energy being spent on things that left me empty rather than anything like full, and that this had been true for longer than I had wanted to admit. I started, quietly and without making announcements about it, thinking about what a different kind of work might look like. Not what job title I wanted or what salary I needed, but what the actual texture of a working day I found meaningful would feel like. I had not asked myself that question directly before. I had asked myself practical questions about careers, skills questions, opportunity questions. The texture question was different, and it led different places. What I found, following the texture question honestly, was something I had known at a deeper level for a long time, but had never given full permission to. I wanted to work with people rather than with systems. I wanted work where the outcome was human rather than operational. I had a strong instinct toward helping and teaching that I had never connected to a professional direction because I had always dismissed it as impractical, as the kind of thing people said when they had not yet figured out what they actually wanted to do, and because the people around me in the previous decade had mostly been in corporate or technical fields, and the ambient culture of those fields had made other directions seem less serious. Living alone, without the ambient culture of anyone else's professional world to navigate, that instinct was more audible. I started listening to it. The process of following the instinct toward working with people rather than with systems was not linear, and did not happen quickly, and I am not going to describe it as though it did, because the dishonest version of this story, where a period of solitude produces a clear revelation that leads directly to a transformed life, is precisely the kind of story that makes people feel inadequate when their own experience of change is slower and messier and less cinematic. Mine was slower and messier. The instinct was real, and I followed it genuinely, but the following took time and produced uncertainty in quantities I had not fully prepared for. What I did, practically, over the months after the 6th month, was begin training as a counselor. Not a dramatic pivot, not a resignation letter followed by a leap into the unknown, but a part-time course that I started while still working, that cost me my evenings twice a week and my Saturday mornings, and that required me to do the kind of self-examination in a structured context that I had been doing in an unstructured one for the previous 6 months. It turned out that the unstructured version had been useful preparation. I was better at the self-examination in the course than I had expected to be because I had been practicing it, alone in my apartment, without knowing that was what I was doing. I want to say something about why counseling specifically, because it is not an obvious destination from project management, and I am aware that the connection requires some explanation. The connection was the accommodation. The thing I had discovered about myself in the 4th month, the extent to which I had spent a decade adjusting my own preferences to fit the available space, had led me to think about where that capacity came from and what it was good for when it was used consciously rather than automatically. Accommodation, deployed deliberately and with the genuine interest of another person as its object rather than the avoidance of conflict as its object, was the core of what helping someone felt like. I had been doing a version of it all my life. I had just been doing it in the wrong direction. The course was difficult in ways I had not anticipated and clarifying in ways I also had not anticipated, and by the end of the first year of it, I had a better understanding of myself than I had accumulated in the 3 decades before, which sounds like an overstatement and is not. The combination of the solitude and the structured self-examination of the training had produced something that I can only describe as an improved legibility of my own interior, a clearer reading of what was actually happening inside me at any given moment, and why, which is a skill that turns out to be useful both for the work I was training for and for being a person in general. I left the project management job about 14 months after I had started the counseling course, not impulsively and not dramatically. I had built enough financial runway to make the transition manageable, had completed enough of the training to know the direction was right, and had told enough people about what I was doing that the decision had been examined from multiple angles before it was made. I left on a Friday afternoon and did not feel the relief I had expected to feel. What I felt instead was the specific anxiety of someone who has removed the thing that was not working and is now standing in the open space where it was, which is a less comfortable feeling than relief, but a more honest one. The open space filled gradually with things that were better. Not immediately, not all at once, but over the following year in the incremental way that new things fill space when you have actually made room for them rather than just hoping they will arrive. I completed the training. I began seeing clients under supervision and discovered in those first supervised sessions that the instinct I had followed had been accurate. The work felt like work in the way that meaningful work feels like work, which is to say demanding and occasionally frustrating, and also consistently alive, in a way that the project management had not been alive in years. I am still in the same apartment. This is relevant because the apartment was where the whole of this began, and I want to say something about what it feels like to be in it, now compared to what it felt like in the first months. It feels like mine in a way it did not at the beginning, which is the ordinary thing that happens when you inhabit a space for long enough. But it also feels like a place that has been useful in a way that goes beyond the ordinary, that has contained something significant and given it room to develop, which is not something I expected from a 1-bedroom apartment in a city I had moved to for unrelated reasons. The silence that had been uncomfortable in the early months is now simply the texture of the space. I have not filled it. I still live alone, by choice rather than by default, and I find that the choice produces a different quality of solitude than the default had. When solitude is chosen, it has a different weight than when it is merely the condition of your circumstances. You inhabit it differently. You are less a person waiting for solitude to end, and more a person who has decided that solitude is, at this particular point in their life, the right container for the work of becoming someone they want to be. I have thought a lot about the decade before, the 10 years of shared kitchens and shared living rooms, and the continuous ambient presence of other people that had been, I now understood, doing double duty. It had been the genuine warmth of human company, which is real and valuable, and something I do not want to dismiss. And it had also been underneath that warmth, a very effective way of not spending too much time alone with myself. Both things were true simultaneously, and I had not seen the second thing clearly while I was inside the first. I do not think the previous decade was a mistake. I want to be careful about that because the narrative of self-discovery through solitude can tip easily into a dismissal of the years before the solitude, a retroactive casting of everything that came before as unconsciousness in contrast to the awakened present. That is too simple and also not fair to the reality of those years, which contained genuine love and genuine friendship and genuine experiences that mattered and that made me who I was when I arrived at the apartment at 30. The accommodating person was real. The person who did not know what they wanted in the absence of other people's wants was real. Those were honest expressions of where I was at each stage. They were just not the full picture. The full picture is what the silence produced, not by being dramatic or by delivering revelations, but by being persistent and patient and absolutely without exit. You cannot leave yourself when there is nobody else to look at. You cannot maintain the version of yourself that only exists in relation to other people when there are no other people present to define yourself against. What you are left with, in the quiet apartment on a Sunday afternoon with nothing on and nowhere to be, is whatever is actually there. What was actually there, it turned out, was more than I had given it credit for. A person who liked mornings and had not known it. A person who was more comfortable with solitude than a decade of avoiding it had suggested. A person whose accommodation had been a skill in disguise rather than a character flaw, once it was redirected towards something more honest than the avoidance of domestic friction. A person who had been living inside a story about himself that was partially accurate and partially the accumulated impression of 10 years of other people's perceptions, and who needed time alone to tell the difference between those two things. I am still telling the difference. I think that work does not end, but I am doing it with more honesty and more patience than I brought to it at 30, standing in an empty apartment for the first time, turning the television on because the question was uncomfortable and I was not ready for it yet. I am readier now, not for all of it, not all at once, but readier incrementally and genuinely, in the way that you get readier for things when you stop running from them and start sitting with them in the quiet and letting them tell you what they actually are. The apartment is still quiet. I still wake at 6:30 without an alarm. I still make coffee in the early morning while the city outside is just beginning, and the light comes through the kitchen window at an angle I have come to know well enough to feel proprietary about. The light that belongs to this specific hour in this specific room in this specific life that is, for the first time in as long as I can remember, organized around something true. That is enough, for now and possibly for longer than now, that is genuinely enough.